Now before we dive in and take a look at all of the syntax that's going to be required from us when we start defining classes, I want to give another analogy that I think is useful for differentiating between our class, which is our data type, and instances or objects of that class. So the analogy I've seen presented before is that our classes are like a cookie cutter. They form a template from which all specific gingerbread cookies come from. And what I mean by that is a baker will have a cookie cutter that keeps into account the basic commonalities and features that all gingerbread must have in common. For example, we can see from our gingerbread over here on the right that each of them has some number of buttons, and it varies between the different gingerbread cookies that we're seeing, but they each have some buttons. They have a decoration type, where we have maybe a hat, or a candy cane, or a scarf, or a bow tie, and those decorations that we add later on to the gingerbread are things that are customizable, but each gingerbread cookie has. Including this gingerbread cookie, we could think of him as having a none type for his decor. One other thing that seems to be varying between the gingerbread cookies is whether or not the buttons have color to them. We could keep track of that with a Boolean variable. And some of the cookies have a decorative belt, while some of the others do not, and so that's a thing we could keep track of as well. And in that sense, we could keep track of the things that make up a gingerbread cookie, and each time we stamp out a gingerbread cookie, it will always have those 4 attributes. Now you can't quite see because it's a little bit too small for this slide, but each one of these abstract squares is representing a gingerbread cookie we just saw, and inside each one of these squares is 4 smaller squares, which I'm thinking of as room in memory to keep track of the number of buttons, the decor type, whether or not the buttons have color, and whether or not the gingerbread cookie is going to have a belt. So each time we create an instance of a gingerbread cookie, it will have these 4 attributes. And we can then personalize those attributes to correspond with the specific instances, which are the gingerbread cookies, gingerbread 1, gingerbread 2, gingerbread 3, and so on. Next, let's take a look at some of the syntax that we need in order to formalize this cookie cutter process that we showed more abstractly on the previous slide. So in order to start defining a class, we use the Python reserve word class, and we follow that up with the name of the class. In our example, maybe gingerbread, or in the previous example, something like point. And then we end that line of code with a colon in order to begin the definition of the body of the class. The very first thing that we want to appear inside of the class is what's called the initializer, or sometimes the constructor. And you can see that this word init that we need is coming from the word initializer. So what we're doing is defining a function, which is the initializer function, that needs the attributes of the class to be passed into it as arguments. Now you'll also notice that the very first argument to our initializer function is something called self, which is another reserved word in Python that we'll discuss a little more in the next video. Now all that you'll see appearing in the initializer function, at least at a basic level in these first examples, is that we are taking the first attribute of the instance of the object and we are setting it equal to a value. What this amounts to in terms of pictures is that each time we wish to create an instance of our class object, what's going to happen is that we're going to have a position in memory that's going to have these attributes associated with that instance. And what we need to do in an initializer is place values into those variable names. So when we create a gingerbread cookie, we need to know ahead of time how many buttons we would like it to have, the decor we would like it to have, whether or not those buttons should be colored, and whether or not that cookie has a belt. And so when we create this instance, we pass in those 4 values to the initializer, and this bit of code is setting that particular instance's first attribute equal to the value passed in the first attribute position. That instance's second attribute of the class is being set equal to whatever argument was being passed in the second attribute position. And that process continues on until we've filled the very last attribute of this particular instance with a value. And so that's what our initializer does, is it creates a spot in memory to have all of these attributes bundled together, and it gives them these initial values that you pass in, that you've decided on when you create that instance. Now later on in the class, we can have other methods that are defined, and these would appear after the definition of the initializer within the body of the class.